Did Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just pull off the most astonishing procedural illusion in the history of the United States Congress? Or did my colleague, Senator John Kennedy, just systematically dismantle an 8-year political brand using nothing more than 2 pieces of standard government paperwork and a missing diamond engagement ring? If you are just tuning in from home, what you are about to hear is the complete breakdown of a political earthquake witnessed from the perspective of those of us who navigate these legislative halls every day. It is the story of how the loudest voice for institutional transparency in modern American politics was cornered into a devastating, career-altering 12-second silence on national television. At the absolute center of this legislative storm is a man named Riley Roberts. Riley Roberts is Representative Ocasio-Cortez's spouse on the official stamped congressional forms that miraculously secured him complimentary, taxpayer-funded international travel to Japan, South Korea, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Italy. He is her spouse on the exact forms that granted him a highly coveted, securely vetted $35,000 VIP ticket to the Met Gala. Yet, by some extraordinary feat of bureaucratic gymnastics, Riley Roberts is somehow not her spouse on the mandatory, legally binding financial disclosure forms that would explicitly require her to reveal his private corporate assets, his consulting clients, and his personal income to the American public. Let that sink in for a moment, because as a fellow lawmaker, I can assure you they are the exact same man sharing the exact same residential address. They sleep in the exact same bed every single night. He is officially recognized as a legally binding spouse on a Monday when the elite, exclusive perks of Washington are being generously distributed, but he magically transforms into a total legal stranger on a Tuesday when the ethical ledger of transparency must be balanced for the voters. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a man who has built a legendary career out of dismantling complex political doublespeak with lethal, folksy precision, correctly called it the most spectacular and creative illusion ever performed in a congressional committee room. He didn't yell, and he certainly didn't pound his fists on the mahogany desk. Instead, he simply opened a plain manila folder and methodically presented the Senate Ethics Subcommittee with every single form, side by side, date by specific date. He showed the entire world and the millions watching live on network television exactly where Mr. Roberts appeared as a husband, and exactly where he vanished into thin air, his legal status fluctuating entirely and exclusively, depending on whether the document in question granted a lavish benefit or demanded basic political transparency. The question Senator Kennedy asked was not about designer dresses, elite cultural galas, or the intricacies of international travel logistics. It was infinitely simpler and therefore infinitely more dangerous. He looked directly across the witness table at the Congresswoman and asked, "Ma'am, is he your husband or isn't he?" Because in his home state of Louisiana, and frankly in every normal household across the 50 states, you absolutely cannot be legally married on the days you want free things and single on the days you have to show the books. What followed was a masterclass in political accountability, demonstrating how a senator from Louisiana asked a congresswoman from the Bronx the absolute simplest, most foundational binary question in the English language, yes or no, and discovered in real time that she could not answer it without jeopardizing absolutely everything she had spent her career building. The exchange began exactly how any seasoned politician would expect, with practiced, aggressive defiance. When the hearing commenced, the Congresswoman immediately leaned into her microphone, attempting to aggressively dismiss the entire premise of the inquiry. She looked at Senator Kennedy and told him that the last time he was considered politically relevant, his party still believed in climate change. She loudly declared that she would absolutely not sit in a chair and be lectured about political ethics by a man who had spent his entire decades-long career in the United States Senate, asking performative questions at hearings and accomplishing absolutely nothing in between them. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the witness table with the rigid, defensive posture of a legislator who had been conceptually and politically challenged on national television at least 4 times before, managing to rebuild herself and her fundraising apparatus each time, and was rapidly running out of patience for a 5th confrontation. Over the past 8 years, political opponents had come at her with receipts, direct quotes, devastating voting grades, and awkward silences. She had successfully outmaneuvered all of them, remaining in Congress, dominating cable television screens, and staying firmly in the mainstream conversation for a potential presidential run in 2028. She survived because, in the era of modern digital politics, losing a congressional hearing is not the equivalent of losing a career, provided you can successfully turn that loss into highly consumable viral media. And she had spent 8 years turning absolutely every moment of her life into exactly that content. However, this particular hearing of the Senate Ethics Subcommittee on Congressional Disclosure Compliance and Spousal Benefits had been convened under entirely different circumstances than a standard policy debate. This hearing was triggered following the House Ethics Committee's formal, highly publicized rebuke of Ocasio-Cortez in July 2025. The specific issue at hand was the glaring, unexplainable inconsistency regarding her domestic partner's legal status. The Senate had rightfully claimed jurisdiction over the matter because the underlying issue directly intersected with federal financial disclosure laws, which are aggressively enforced at the federal level across both chambers. Every major news network in the country carried the feed live. The story of the man who was both married and unmarried at the exact same time had been trending across every social media platform for 3 consecutive weeks, and the nation desperately tuned in to watch Kennedy ask the specific question that the internet had been screaming since August. The woman who had just condescendingly questioned the senator's relevance had, in fact, been formally reprimanded for simultaneously claiming her partner Riley Roberts was and was not her legal spouse. She had officially listed him as a spouse to receive a $35,000 Met Gala ticket, luxurious international travel to 6 different sovereign nations, and complimentary dinners, while systematically and deliberately excluding him from mandatory financial disclosures to successfully avoid revealing his private assets to the public. Her highly paid legal counsel had argued in a written defense that Roberts was considered a spouse for the purposes of receiving ethical exemptions and campaign benefits, but strictly not a spouse for the purposes of financial disclosure requirements. The Ethics Committee had labeled this deeply cynical arrangement inconsistent and ordered repayment. Predictably, she had not repaid a single dime. Senator John Neely Kennedy sat 5 chairs away from the center of the dais, wearing a dark suit and a blue tie that was slightly too wide for modern Washington standards. He bore the calm, unbothered expression of a seasoned, veteran politician who had just been told he was entirely irrelevant by someone half his age, had heard far better insults from far sharper minds over his 30 years in law and politics, and was now taking his absolute, deliberate time cleaning his reading glasses. Cleaning his glasses was the quiet, terrifying ritual he always performed right before opening a folder that contained the most devastating evidence imaginable. He reached for his wireframes, took them off, held them up to the harsh, fluorescent committee room light, and wiped the left lens in 3 slow, agonizingly deliberate circular passes. He put them back on, leaned forward into the microphone, and began to speak, starting with a story about a man back home in Louisiana, Boudreaux's cousin Thibodeau, who had been married for 37 years to the exact same woman every single day of his adult life. Kennedy noted that there was never any confusion in Thibodeau's house. Nobody ever had to check a government form, consult a lawyer, or look at a calendar to find out whether Thibodeau was legally married on a random Tuesday afternoon. Kennedy then slowly opened his manila folder, noting that the congresswoman sitting across from him clearly had a very different arrangement. Kennedy explained in a voice dripping with polite Southern incredulity that the committee had prepared an analytical timeline which he found genuinely entertaining. He clarified that it wasn't entertaining because it was humorous, but rather because it was wildly, almost breathtakingly creative. He openly called her paperwork arrangement with Mr. Roberts the most creative piece of legal fiction he had seen in over 30 years of practicing law. He pulled out a single, devastating document featuring two stark, undeniable columns. The left column listed every single official government form on which her congressional office had explicitly and willingly named Riley Roberts as her spouse. The right column listed every single financial disclosure from which Riley Roberts was entirely and deliberately absent. Kennedy announced he was going to read both columns aloud to the dead quiet room, reading the left column first. He detailed the September 2021 Met Gala attendance form, where Roberts was listed as a spouse to receive a complimentary ticket valued at $250, plus access to an exclusive, heavily guarded event costing $35,000 per person. Ocasio-Cortez's hands rested on the table in a highly controlled, deeply practiced position representing the armored, forced stillness of a woman who had meticulously reviewed hours of footage of her own previous hearings and realized that her hands were always the first physical tell to betray her internal panic. Kennedy continued his methodical march down the list, his voice steady and relentless, listing the 2023 official, fully funded congressional travels to Japan, South Korea, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Italy, all with Roberts listed as a spouse. He then noted for the official record that Roberts had also been formally issued a highly restricted congressional spouse identification card. This elite security credential grants a member's partner unfettered, unescorted access to restricted congressional facilities, exclusive political events, and heavily guarded taxpayer-funded privileges that regular American citizens will never see in their lifetimes. After reading this exhausting list of elite perks, Kennedy deliberately set the left column down, picked up the right column, held it up high, and slowly turned it, so the entire committee, the press gallery, and the television cameras could clearly see it. "It's blank, ma'am," he stated softly, setting the empty page beside the dense list of 14 official entries 14 separate times. He noted her partner was explicitly listed as a spouse on forms that entitled him to free tickets, free global travel, free meals, and free credentialed VIP access. Yet, on the financial disclosure forms, the one single document per year, specifically designed by law to force elected officials to reveal their partner's hidden assets, business interests, corporate clients, and income streams to the voters, he was not her spouse. He simply did not appear, and the column was completely, intentionally empty. Kennedy then read directly from a defensive letter submitted by her own attorney to the Ethics Committee in May 2025, which explicitly stated that Roberts is considered a spouse in the context of federal campaign finance benefits, but explicitly not for financial disclosure requirements. Kennedy looked directly through his glasses at her and summarized the sheer, unadulterated audacity of this legal defense, pointing out she was openly claiming in writing that he was her legal spouse under one specific set of rules that showered her with luxurious things, and entirely not a spouse under another set of rules that strictly required public transparency. Same man, same exact government form, same residential address. Completely different answer, Kennedy noted. He leaned closer to his microphone and remarked that down in Louisiana, folks have a lot of different names for a man who claims to be married on the days he wants to max out the joint credit card, and claims to be single on the days the monthly bill arrives in the mailbox. Most of those names, Kennedy noted with a wry smile, were simply not fit to be repeated in a dignified congressional hearing room. But he added that the absolute politest thing anyone could say is that such a man isn't actually confused about the status of his marriage. He is simply confused about which audience is currently listening to him. The hearing room reacted with a sound that is incredibly rare on Capitol Hill, the distinct, uncontrollable sound of a room full of hardened political operatives and journalists processing something that was genuinely, undeniably absurd. The sound hovered dangerously close to bipartisan, genuine laughter, and laughter at pure absurdity is the one weapon that manufactured moral authority has never successfully learned to defend against. As we, in this line of work, know, you can debate policy, scream about partisan witch hunts, or label a line of questioning politically motivated, but you absolutely cannot spin laughter. The utter absurdity of being legally married for free international first-class plane tickets and a total stranger for the purposes of asset disclosure was a contradiction so massive, so blatantly hypocritical, that it crossed every conceivable ideological boundary in the room. Ocasio-Cortez's jaw tightened into a rigid, highly defensive set, deploying the same laugh-resistant posture she had used in previous brutal hearings. But a face desperately trying not to react in a room full of people who are openly chuckling at a devastating joke only makes that face more glaringly visible to the cameras. But Senator Kennedy was far from finished. The trap had only just been sprung. He explained that the committee's analysts didn't just sit around counting contradictory forms, they asked the next logical, terrifying question: what exactly was Mr. Roberts desperately trying to hide? Kennedy produced a second document showing analysts had meticulously cross-referenced Roberts' professional profile, his public business registrations, and his consulting firm's active client list directly against the specific corporate sectors regulated by the House committees on which Ocasio-Cortez actively served and legislated. The findings were nothing short of explosive, revealing that Roberts operated a highly lucrative user experience, consulting and web development practice with active clients, including at least 3 major technology companies operating directly in the exact same sectors overseen by legislative committees. Kennedy laid out the devastating reality perfectly. If Roberts were truthfully listed as her spouse on her financial disclosures, those highly lucrative corporate client relationships would immediately become a matter of public record. The working class voters in her Bronx district would finally know that the man sleeping in her home had active, profitable business interests in the exact same industries she was actively tasked with regulating. But because he was deliberately and surgically excluded from that one specific form, those interests remained deeply shrouded in darkness, and the voters had absolutely no idea. Kennedy pointed out the practical effect of this staggering bureaucratic gymnastics. It resulted in free luxury trips to Japan while maintaining deeply hidden corporate business interests. It meant securing highly exclusive $35,000 Met Gala tickets while keeping high-paying corporate clients completely invisible to the press and the public. The taxpayer-funded perks were highly visible, but the massive, glaring, ethical conflicts of interest were deeply buried. Kennedy stated flatly, his voice echoing in the silent room, that this was not a sophisticated legal interpretation, it was a magic trick. At this precise, agonizing moment, Ocasio-Cortez's left hand, the hand that had proudly displayed a diamond engagement ring in countless photographs from April 2022, until it quietly and mysteriously vanished from public view in November 2023, moved involuntarily. The hand dropped below the edge of the heavy wooden table for a fraction of a second, an unconscious, deeply instinctual check of a person whose physical body needed immediate verification of whether the ring was still there. It was not, and when her hand slowly returned to the surface of the table, it was bare, making the glaring emptiness of that specific finger suddenly the absolute loudest, most visible detail in the entire room. Kennedy pivoted smoothly, proving he missed absolutely nothing, and announced to the room that he wanted to talk specifically about the engagement ring. The entire energy in the room shifted instantly from a dry legal abstraction about disclosure thresholds to a deeply human, universally understood detail. Everyone in that room implicitly understood the cultural weight of an engagement ring, what it signifies to wear one proudly, and the heavy, ominous implications of suddenly choosing to take it off. Kennedy noted that the couple had famously and publicly gotten engaged in Puerto Rico in April 2022, and hundreds of photographs clearly documented the ring on her left hand throughout the entirety of 2022 and well into the summer of 2023. However, aggressive investigative reporting had recently confirmed she had not been photographed wearing the engagement ring in any public setting since November 2023, the exact window when the House Ethics Committee's investigation into the Met Gala ticket began to dramatically intensify. Kennedy offered a folksy disclaimer, stating he was neither a professional jeweler nor a licensed marriage counselor, acknowledging that people remove jewelry for innocent personal reasons. But after spending 30 years interrogating witnesses, he had developed a relentless habit of noticing things, primarily that the ring proudly appeared when the engagement generated incredibly positive media coverage, and it quietly, conveniently disappeared. The exact moment the ethics investigation became a serious, career-threatening legal liability. The physical presence or absence of the ring, exactly like her partner's marital status on official government paperwork, seemed to magically correlate with whatever narrative was most politically and legally convenient on any given day. She was engaged when she wanted the fairy tale story for the cameras, and utterly not engaged when she desperately needed a federal financial investigation to go away. Ring on for the glamorous photo op, ring off for the legal ambiguity. Kennedy looked across the table with an expression of genuine, profound disappointment, noting that where he comes from, relationships that fundamentally change based on who happens to be asking the questions are called arrangements. He conceded that private arrangements between consenting adults are their own business, but when an arrangement becomes the precise, engineered mechanism by which a sitting member of Congress actively hides potential financial conflicts of interest from the 718,000 working-class people who elected her, it entirely stops being a relationship and becomes a deliberate, calculated scheme. Ocasio-Cortez's left hand remained resting on the table, but her fingers slowly, unconsciously curled inward, forming a loose, protective shell around the empty space where the diamond used to sit. It was a microscopic, deeply human movement, indicating she knew exactly why the ring was gone, she knew exactly what its absence looked like to a trained investigator, and she knew that Kennedy had perfectly and publicly deciphered the maneuver. But Kennedy wasn't remotely done pulling apart the carefully constructed progressive narrative, transitioning seamlessly from the missing ring to the location of the engagement itself to discuss a highly controversial trip to Puerto Rico taken in December 2025. He pulled up official Federal Election Commission reports showing that her political campaign had spent approximately $50,000 in Puerto Rico on luxury oceanfront hotels, upscale fine dining, and an incredibly expensive venue rental at a location where the global musical artist Bad Bunny happened to be performing. Kennedy let the contrasting words hang in the dead air of the committee room. $50,000, luxury beachfront resorts, Bad Bunny, then pointed out the supreme, sickening irony of the expenditure. This massive, lavish spending occurred during what her campaign had proudly and publicly branded the Fighting Oligarchy Tour. She was touring the country, supposedly fighting the billionaire class and corporate greed, while simultaneously dropping $50,000 of small donor campaign money on luxury Caribbean accommodations and concert venues. Kennedy deployed another highly strategic, lethal anecdote, recalling a constituent, good old Boudreaux, once asking him to clearly define what an oligarch actually is. Kennedy replied that an oligarch is simply a person who uses other people's money to live like absolute royalty, all while loudly telling the subjects that they are fighting for their economic liberation. Boudreaux had laughed and said, "Senator, in Louisiana, we just call that a politician." But upon hearing about the $50,000 Fighting Oligarchy Tour, Boudreaux had paused and asked, wait, she spent $50,000 of campaign money fighting against rich people? How much does fighting for them cost? The room broke into sustained, uncontrollable laughter as Kennedy found his deadly, inescapable rhythm, using folksy stories as perfect, disarming vehicles for devastating financial facts that were always much funnier and sadder because they were entirely real. Kennedy then read from a brutal financial analysis comparing her campaign's luxury travel spending with her congressional district office's actual budget for constituent services during the exact same 12-month period. The numbers were staggering. While her campaign blew over $53,000 on hotels and luxury accommodations, her district office's budget for actual casework, helping the elderly with Social Security assistance, processing complex immigration paperwork, fighting for veterans' benefits, and handling local housing complaints, was funded at a rate 31% below the House average for New York members. Her campaign spent 3.7 times more on luxury travel, VIP concerts, and political posturing than her official office spent on actually helping the desperate, working-class people who voted for her. Kennedy looked at her with quiet, piercing intensity, noting that her grassroots donors The people scraping together $16.81 from their minimum wage paychecks honestly believed they were funding a political revolution, but were instead unwittingly funding a luxury lifestyle. Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward, aggressively attempting to seize back control of the rapidly collapsing narrative by loudly stating that her campaign expenditures were fully transparent and entirely compliant with all FEC regulations. But Kennedy simply raised a single, patient finger, a polite, unyielding request for silence that carried the immense, undeniable authority of a man who had controlled the entire room for nearly 30 minutes and had earned their absolute silence. Her defensive sentence hung awkwardly in the air and then simply evaporated as Kennedy softly agreed that the spending was indeed transparent, pointing out that transparency was exactly how his investigative staff had found the receipts in the first place. He clarified that the fundamental ethical question was not whether the spending was legally reported on a spreadsheet, but whether the working class voters who gave her their hard-earned money to fight corporate greed actually knew they were paying for Bad Bunny concert venues and luxury resort suites. Kennedy pushed straight through the resulting nervous laughter, masterfully tying the entire narrative together by connecting the lavish Puerto Rico trip to the missing engagement ring and the blatantly contradictory bureaucratic forms. He laid out the grand, unifying theory of her entire political operation. It was all the exact same trick. The spouse trick involved eagerly taking free luxury items when he was legally a husband, but ruthlessly hiding his corporate assets when he magically wasn't. The campaign finance trick involved rhetorically fighting oligarchy for the television cameras, while quietly booking luxury Caribbean resorts when the FEC reports were eventually filed. The ethics trick involved wearing a performative tax-the-rich dress to an elite gala while illegally accepting the $35,000 ticket as an impermissible corporate gift. It was the same exact maneuver every single time, just printed on a slightly different government form, designed to say one highly marketable, populist thing to a massive public audience, quietly do the exact opposite when no one was watching, and pray to God that nobody ever bothered to line up the paperwork. Kennedy gestured widely to the documents covering his desk, the chronological timeline of her spouse status, the totally blank financial disclosure, the timeline of the disappearing engagement ring, and the campaign spending analysis. He looked her dead in the eye and delivered the killing blow. Somebody finally lined up the forms, ma'am. Ocasio-Cortez's physical posture completely contracted, the combative stance of a political street fighter shrinking inward in a familiar biological reaction of a body desperately trying to occupy less space to take less damage. But in politics, damage is determined entirely by the sheer accuracy of the weapon, and Kennedy's weapon was surgically, devastatingly accurate. Kennedy's voice dropped into the solemn, almost pastoral tone of a man preparing to close a trap from which there is absolutely no escape. Speaking of his own long marriage, noting he was married to the exact same woman every single day, whether he wanted free things or had to legally show the books to the government. He stressed that marriage is a profound human commitment, not a bureaucratic toggle switch. You can simply adjust depending on whether a government form is giving you a massive benefit or requiring you to sacrifice a shred of your privacy. He aggressively and methodically recapped the elite privileges her partner had enjoyed entirely because she legally classified him as her spouse. The highly exclusive Met Gala ticket, the taxpayer-funded international flights, and the secure congressional spouse credential granting VIP access. Then, Kennedy brought the absolute hammer down, noting that on the one single day out of the entire year, when federal transparency laws explicitly require her to tell the American people what that man owns, he suddenly, miraculously, ceases to be her spouse. He simply vanishes into the ether, claiming no assets, zero liabilities, and absolutely no corporate holdings, reduced to a blank piece of paper. 14 forms declared him a spouse. One form declared him a total stranger, resulting in a staggering 14-to-1 ratio. And the one form where he magically disappeared was the exact transparency document designed by Congress to prevent this exact type of shadowy, corrupt financial arrangement. Kennedy leaned forward and asked the final question again with devastating, inescapable clarity. Ma'am, is he your husband or isn't he? Because the 718,000 people in your district who believe in you, who give you their hard-earned money, who trust you to fight for them, deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know if the man sleeping in your house is consulting for the massive tech companies you regulate, and if he is missing from your financial disclosure because there is genuinely nothing to disclose, or if there is something highly lucrative you are desperately trying to keep hidden. Kennedy noted that the public has absolutely no idea because neither the Ethics Committee, nor the Federal Election Commission, nor the voters back home can ever figure out which day it is. After a highly calculated, theatrical silence, he delivered one final anecdote, stating that a man who is married on Saturdays and single on Sundays isn't confused about his romantic relationship. He is just deeply confused about which audience he is currently trying to manipulate. He looked directly at her and asked the final fatal question. Ma'am, which audience are you talking to? What followed was 12 agonizing, excruciating seconds of dead air in a packed Senate hearing room. She couldn't answer because she instantly recognized the trap she had built for herself over 8 long years. And she knew that both exits led straight off a political cliff. If she answered yes, every financial disclosure she had ever filed over the years without listing his corporate assets was a massive regulatory violation, turning every tech client he had into an undisclosed conflict of interest and using the 14 forms as hard, undeniable evidence of her premeditated deception. If she answered no, every taxpayer-funded perk he received became an illegal, impermissible gift, leading to severe legal scrutiny for securing government benefits by legally falsifying a familial relationship. Yes resulted in a devastating disclosure violation that could end her career. No resulted in massive regulatory liabilities that could lead to legal peril. The crushing, suffocating 12 seconds of silence became the de facto answer that confirmed both realities simultaneously. She didn't look at the television cameras or the hostile committee members, but instead let her eyes drift slowly down to her own left hand, staring blankly at the empty ring finger that had proudly worn a diamond for magazine photo ops and rapidly abandoned it for ethics investigations. She looked at her own hand the exact way a perpetrator looks at the evidence they failed to conceal. The sheer absence of the ring was the loud, undeniable answer that the arrangement itself was the entire point of the exercise. Kennedy watched her closely with the infinite, terrifying patience of a seasoned operator, slowly closed his manila folder, and delivered his final assessment. If you have to check a calendar to know which days you are legally married, you are not actually married, you are managing a legal liability disclosure. He stated he had no further questions. Ocasio-Cortez eventually found her voice, delivering a 2-minute and 19-second response universally panned by pundits across the spectrum as the most defensive, rattled, and incoherent performance of her entire career. As any lawmaker knows, defending a mathematically impossible, contradictory relationship status is impossible, because a relationship is either real or it isn't, and her forms claimed both. She complained bitterly that the ethics investigation was a partisan witch hunt, argued weakly that her relationship was a private matter, leaned heavily on her lawyer's highly creative interpretation of spousal status, and passionately defended her campaign's right to spend money in Puerto Rico. But crucially, devastatingly, she never answered the core question, never addressed the 14-to-1 ratio, never explained the disappearing engagement ring, ignored the tech consulting clients, and never justified spending nearly 4 times more on luxury Caribbean travel than on helping her impoverished constituents. Kennedy didn't even bother to react to her panicked filibuster. He was already packing his briefcase and giving a subtle, knowing nod to the press gallery, silently communicating that they had all just witnessed the exact same political execution. 14 times a spouse, 0 times disclosed, and 12 seconds of deafening silence shattered a career built entirely on the fragile illusion of authenticity. The fallout was instantaneous, viral, and absolutely catastrophic. with the visual of the 14-entry column placed next to the totally blank disclosure form viewed 29 million times in a single day. The Schrödinger's spouse meme was weaponized into a fatal blow, while the breakdown of the engagement ring timeline circulated heavily through social media, effectively destroying her carefully curated, relatable image among female voters by reducing a complex scandal into a deeply relatable story of personal betrayal and manipulation. The third and most lethal clip was the 12 seconds of total silence, the horrifying realization of a politician who knew that both yes and no would destroy her. The House Ethics Committee immediately escalated the matter into a full-scale, formal investigation, issuing subpoenas for all of Roberts' financial records, business registrations, and complete client lists. Within a week, investigative journalists publicly identified the tech clients, completely validating Kennedy's core thesis that the magic trick was designed purely for concealment. In the Senate, a bipartisan coalition quickly drafted the Congressional Partner Disclosure Act, universally dubbed the AOC Loophole Act. The ultimate irony for the politician who had built an empire screaming about the need for financial transparency. Now the sole reason a new transparency law had to be written, late-night television, which had fiercely protected her for years, finally turned on her with a Saturday Night Live sketch racking up 41 million views, leading to an internal polling collapse where her authenticity rating plummeted 20 points below her historical baseline. Kennedy simply offered one final thought in a Capitol hallway. When a person cannot give a straight answer about the status of their own marriage, the real answer is usually that it depends entirely on who happens to be asking the question. Far away from Washington, everyday Americans watched the footage and came to the same quiet conclusion that sitting down with attorneys to legally engineer a system where you are a husband for luxury perks and a stranger for asset disclosure requires a level of calculated, cold-blooded dishonesty that cannot be forgiven. Taking off an engagement ring to hide a paper trail isn't politics. It's corporate espionage on the taxpayer's dime. She had built the most elaborate loophole in modern congressional history, utilizing the exact system she claimed to despise, to enrich herself and hide her conflicts from the people who trusted her most. 14 forms claiming love, one form claiming ignorance, is not a marriage. That is a highly leveraged subscription model, and the American public was finally reading the terms and conditions. God bless the people who stay married through the good forms and the bad forms. God bless the $16 donors who realized they bought luxury resort tickets instead of a revolution. And God bless every American who fills out their government paperwork honestly, while wondering why the people who write the laws never seem to have to follow them. 12 seconds of silence was the only answer that mattered.